Welcome, everyone, to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies. In today's episode, we are joined by Len, who is an environmental activist, and he's going to discuss some of the background and the origins of Earth Day, which is coming up on April 22nd. So, Len, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kyle.
So let's talk a little bit about your background first to get started. If you could just briefly introduce yourself and describe the type of work that you do and how you first got involved in environmental struggles.
Sure. Yeah, I'm involved with quite a bit right now. And for some time, I'm basically saving land. Saving land is a critical component to climate mitigation. So spend a lot of time with what's called passive open space. That is land that has a porous surface, a permeable surface, and that allows green organisms to grow, and that allows carbon dioxide to be taken in, and good things happen. So I've been doing that for quite some time.
So what type of work is that with saving land? You said it's passive land. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. It means the best description is land with a permeable surface. In other words, rainwater, vapors easily get into the land and are made use of soil critters, and green organisms grow like trees and shrubs and plants and flowers and all that. And when you're growing green organisms, you're going to be able to take in carbon dioxide, the opposite of impermeable surfaces like tar, cement, and structures that don't allow all that good stuff to happen. So that's pretty much what I involve with myself right now. And it's quite a thing, because when you go to save land, you learn a lot of economic and political lessons. We could talk more about that if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by the idea of this land, because I know that it's a limited resource in the US and in the world. So is your work mostly focused in the US, or is it international?
Basically in the United States. But a lot of the work becomes intertwined with also peace. A lot of environmental struggles are connected to peace. And that may be one of the best ways to get into this. If I could explain how those struggles are intertwined, and we can get back to land questions if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay, so what I'll ask you to do, Kyle, and our listeners, is to come back with me to 1969. And I was on a bridge over the Naugatuck River in Connecticut, and it was nighttime. And while I didn't know it at that time, this was going to lead me up to the first Earth Day and many other Earth Days after. And it also led me to an error that I made. I guess we could say, well, I didn't recognize it then, a political error. But that's getting way ahead. Let me get back to the bridge and being over this river. What happened is smoke billowed up all around me from the water to the bridge, wrapped around me and my car. I had immediately thought maybe the river was on fire, because I had heard of that happened in the Midwest, I guess. And I thought it was some version of Dante's Inferno. Here I was surrounded all this what seemed like smoke. But there were related experiences. So while we're on the bridge here in my car, there's some other pieces I should mention. I was teaching grade school at the time, and I had my grade school students sample the same river, Naugatuck River, and we could find only one fish, which was clearly distressed. And despite our best efforts, brought it back, put it in an aquarium, tried to nurture it, but sadly, this other being lost its life, just faded away. So it was a lesson for both the teacher and the students. I also had my chemistry students, a little bit older, from the high school, took samples from the same Naugatuck River, and they found heavy metals such as nickel, copper, lead, and other elements used in plating. Now, that's just a little background. What was I experiencing that night? I also remember looking to my right while I was on the bridge, and I saw through the mist and smoke, it seemed a flash of light. It was something like it seemed suspended in the air. It was like something depicted in movies of dragons, with fire coming out of their mouth. But what I was seeing, it took a little while to put this together, were metals that were molten. In other words, they hit the river. Up came a lot of steam, basically, and of course, it was killing other beings in the river. Just as when the commodities produced there, it took me a while to learn this. Commodities being produced at that factory hit people in war zones. So there's this pieces of a puzzle were scattered about, but certainly the pieces were there. It would just take a while to put them all together. So let me back up even a bit more, give some background. Eudora Welty, the wonderful writer, said one time, if you know one place well, you know a lot of places well. Well, if you know one person well, you could also know a lot of other people. So I'm going to take you back to the 1960s, about 1968, actually. And I had moved from the Naugatuck River Valley to New Haven for a number of years. And I had a high school friend excuse me, visit. And we were sitting in a bar restaurant. We were talking about what we came to know as the U.S. war in Vietnam. And I remember he was sitting in a uniform. He had joined the National Guard, which was one of the ways the young people tried to avoid being swept into the U.S. war in Vietnam. Of course, that would end fairly soon. National Guard, as we know now, gets sent over all over the world. Anyway, there we were sitting there. He's in his uniform, and I said to him, well, it's a good thing at least we haven't lost any high school friends. And he said to me, oh no, Len, we lost a friend there from high school, a high school chum, as we would have said back then. And I kind of stared out the window for a while. I was just kind of shocked that, what entered my mind is that, young people don't die. How could this be? Now, that might be a little easier for young people to grasp now because unfortunately we have all these mass killings here. And of course, there's already been the Iraq War, Afghanistan, now and other wars, unending wars, it seems. But back then, it was really shocking. But of course, the military draft at that time would engulf young adults, like myself and like my friend throughout the country, and over 50,000 would die in Vietnam. And of course, when you first read that initial pricking of your consciousness, you begin to realize Vietnamese were being killed, young and old and in between. Millions of Vietnamese were killed during that war. And later, more would be deformed and die from the defoliant, Agent Orange. I know you had a wonderful Pants on Fire podcast on that. I didn't learn about the defoliant Agent Orange until the World Youth Festival in 1974. It was handed out by the Vietnamese delegation there, and it went into Agent Orange. That was my first introduction to biological chemical weapons. And as you found out in your podcast, wildlife died, their habitat was destroyed. You attack the environment and you expose people to ever more lethal weapons. That's what was going on. So more pieces of the puzzle that I and many other youth were beginning to spread about the board, but where did they all fit? Now, Agent Orange, as well as napalm, was made by companies like Dow Chemical Company. I remember when students protested that company's presence on a university campus, they were beaten by cops, basically, and other security forces. So what I learned is that the defense of profits by the government was emerging out of this fog of war. Of course, it just got worse. Kent State, students were killed by National Guard and crippled by gunfire. So more pieces of the puzzle. And jumping probably too far ahead, between 1975 and going into the 1980s, Vietnamese fled their country. Many who collaborated with the U.S. military streamed into the USA, as they have now from the Middle East and other places of the world. Some would settle into Torrington, Connecticut, which was along the same Naugatuck River. And an even crueler twist of history, some of those refugees would eventually toil in the Torrington Company, and they made aluminum products. And that was one of the key ingredients to making daisy cutter bombs. daisy cutter bombs, going back a few years, were actually used in Vietnam, and they literally, not chemically, through bomb explosions, cleared trees, impacted wildlife and people in a circular killing fields. These cruel weapons, what weapons aren't cruel, but these cruel weapons were part of the war profiting puzzle. So anyway, stick with 1969 for a minute. And here's where I made a mistake. In later 1969, it may have actually been early 1970, the mayor of the small town I was working in asked me to come to his office. School administrators told me, look, Len, the mayor wants to see you. Of course, I said, oh gosh, what is this all about? I'm in my mid-20s. I have no particular political persuasion. I didn't belong to anything, any particular group. May have joined a Quaker group. In the anger over losing a high school friend, I did attend with many youth peace marches in Washington, D.C. in 1968, 69. There were massive marches. Also, 1971. I remember that last march in 71 was so large, we got up to march and there was no place to march. There were people from the beginning of the march to the end of the march in D.C. But anyway, here I am sitting in front of the mayor, and he says, Len, I'd like you to help get young people together to this thing coming up called Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. So he talked about, picking up litter, if you could organize them to do that. And being a combination of emotionally immature and militant, I refused. I said, wait a minute. I said, there's a factory here that's killing all life in the river here. I'm not even sure I mentioned the U.S. war in Vietnam, but I said, we've got to point that out. And of course, unbeknownst to me, his mayor probably was getting funds from the Torrington Company, so I refused to do this. And of course, I could see he was getting angry and I got myself out of there. But I missed an opportunity. I mean, I could have worked with some of the very students I was taking down to the river and participated in what would have been a litter pickup, which eventually did happen. Another young teacher was talked into doing it, and I could have been with those young people and then talked to them about what the Torrington Company was doing to the river, but I missed that opportunity. So lesson learned, don't let your militancy run ahead of you. You can take advantage of openings when you get them, and I missed that opening. Anyway, I hope that helps a little bit in giving you some, not only my background, but really, again, like Eudora Welty said, one person back then, a lot of people. And what I was going through was happening to a lot of young people back then.
Mm-hmm. So the mayor actually was the one who first mentioned Earth Day, and this was the first Earth Day that happened in 1970, and 20 million people participated. And so I guess, could we talk a little bit about the background of how that came about? How did Earth Day first come about? And how did this first one come off in such a successful manner?
Sure. It happened with people that were a heck of a lot more politically mature than me. But let me do it. Let's do it this way. Just a few years ago, about 5 years ago, I was at an Earth Day celebration, and there are celebrations now, which is a good thing, combined with some sober analysis of what's really going on. We'll get to that, I'm sure, soon. But anyway, I was at this Earth Day celebration about 5 years ago, and the state representative started talking about, remember, this was a different administration than national administration. It started talking about the Bush family and claimed that Barbara Bush, which was the wife of, that was George H. Bush, going back to the early 90s, that she was responsible, again, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, that Barbara Bush was responsible for the first Earth Day. Now, we all enjoy tall tales in our youth. That was certainly a false narrative. I knew it, being much more politically aware now, and I knew that was a false narrative, being that it was disingenuous and both dangerous. That made me pull together what I did know, but made me pull together the real story more. So let's go back much further to how we got to the real background to the grassroots struggles that led up to Earth Day. Things, you just don't get 20 million people together on a day in 1970 with a lot of grassroots struggles leading up to that point. So we have to do away actually with a couple myths. One myth is that there are no struggles happening going back into the 1950s, some of the worst Cold War years, because there was the ban the bomb movement. There's very good chapters in a fairly new book called Faith in the Masses by Tony Pikowski, 2020, that goes through this. I really would encourage listeners to read up on that, or if they like movies, the movie called The Way We Were goes into some of the ban the bomb movement and the Cold War and the struggles that took place during the Cold War. People tend to think it was, kind of a political wasteland. It wasn't. There were struggles going on that were very important. Also, what you wouldn't know, again, unless you really dig into books like Faith in the Masses, is that the struggles involve both peace and the environment. These struggles have been, that nexus of peace and the environment that were taking place going back right into the 1950s. So let's dig into that. In the fall of 1956, there was a meeting in St. Louis, Missouri about milk. There was a connection being made here to what's called fallout, or what's called back then fallout. It's radioactive material. In particular, it was an element called strontium-90, which was a byproduct of nuclear weapons testing out west. Excuse me. Now, what did this this dangerous substance have to do with cows' milk? Well, strontium-90 very briefly has what scientists call a half-life of about 29 years, but the reality is it can last hundreds of years to break down. And strontium-90 is associated with bone cancer, also leukemia. Medical health people would say strontium-90 is a bone seeker. In other words, that radioactive isotope likes the chemistry of our bones generally, and that's where it'll seek out. So a danger with bone cancer, also blood to a certain extent. So anyway, longer story short, 18 women got together and sent a letter to the U.S. Health Department, also to the St. Louis Health Department, right down at the grassroots in Missouri. One woman's name was Edna Gellhorn. She had earlier led a similar campaign for just pure milk, but this was, obviously a more daunting problem, environmental health problem. Fortunately, present was Virginia Brodine. Now, Virginia Brodine was a member of the International Lady Garment Workers Union, LGWU, in the labor movement. And she lent organizational help, of course, a good consciousness of what had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and she was certainly politically left. And she knew Barry Commoner. And Barry Commoner, quite well known, or would become known on a lot of issues, a lot of medical issues and political issues. He was at Washington University with other scientists. Now, Washington University is in St. Louis, not to confuse listeners. And so he would add with the science. In fact, wrote a story about all that in coming years called The Closing Circle. So the idea cropped up with this wonderful mesh of people at the grassroots and union and scientists. And the idea came up to test baby teeth and to see if radioactive material was making its way into the ecosystem, into plants eaten by cows, and got involved with cows, and then milk goes into a lot of bodies. So it was also Commoner who shared the idea with Virginia Brodine. I had a chance to work with Virginia for about 12 years in the late 80s into the 1990s, the early millennium. So I'd heard bits and pieces of the story and now was researching it even more. But it was Commoner who came up with the idea of getting citizens to work together with scientists and then inform the broader public. Kind of like Dr. Fauci was doing with, if you think about it, with the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic. So this gave birth to a grassroots group called the Greater St. Louis Citizens Committee for Nuclear Information. Kind of a long handle, but it was exactly what they were doing. The Greater St. Louis Citizens Committee for Nuclear Information. There were two other women, Gloria Gordon and Judy Baumgarten. They played important roles that kept this grassroots group rolling for the next 5 years. Now, you got to remember, this is a Cold War atmosphere. This is the middle of the 1950s. The Rosenbergs had been executed, unfortunately, and to question anything the U.S. government was doing, particularly the military, was quickly bring out the communist charge. So what helped to break down this toxic atmosphere actually was the civil rights movement, which cropped up in the 50s, led by Martin Luther King, that a lot of people are familiar with. But that was the early civil rights movement gaining momentum in the South, and then eventually the exposure and censure by the U.S. Senate of the arch anti-communist Senator Joe McCarthy, that also helped beginning to break down the beginnings of the breakdown of that Cold War atmosphere. But of course, we had the Cold War right until early 1990, but this was the heart of it. So to help spread the message and the dangers in the 1950s of radioactive material finding its way into the ecosystem, including humans, was a group of 20 scientists. So it was this alliance of grassroots environmentalists, union, left elements, and scientists that led to the publication of the magazine called Nuclear Information in 1964. That became Citizen and Scientist. So this little newsletter they were sending out was growing, and now became, in 1964, Citizen and Scientist. Now, just another little piece of historical background, 64, there was a senator running for president called Senator Goldwater. He was an extremist, and he was set to use atomic nuclear weapons. That was part of his repertoire. I vaguely remember that as a older teenager at the time, not understanding it, but that was also part of the background right into 1964, near the start of the U.S. war in Vietnam. So still very much the Cold War. Now, around this same time, 63, 62, 63, there was a woman scientist, a woman scientist that became the talk of the country and the world, actually. Her name was Rachel Carson, and she put out a book called Silent Spring. That burst on the scene. I can remember a young professor I had at the time assigned that book to us. I'm forever grateful to that professor, young guy himself. But that book had the first chapter talked about a spring. It was fictitious, a spring when no birds came. But there's a whole backstory to that. Very briefly, Rachel Carson combined the skills of a seasoned writer. She went to school to a private school and was really trained in writing. Then became a government biologist. So she got a science background. So she combined writing with science in a really wonderful way. So what happened is she had been alerted. She wrote a few books in the 50s, actually involving the ocean, Under the Sea Wind. It could be some people might be familiar with, but really wasn't a national figure until she wrote Silent Spring. Because what happened is a friend of hers in the Audubon world, as we know, birds, right? Audubon. The Audubon organization had mentioned to her, look, I'm seeing a lot of these birds die in my backyard and elsewhere. And so Rachel Carson got, tuned into that, studied it as a scientist, but also as a writer. So she wrote this very fictional first chapter to his book, Silent Spring, when there came spring and no birds sang. But she followed that up with some real data, and she spoke on the Audubon circuit, which was kind of like especially then, a kind of a polite, we would say middle class, upper class even circuit. But believe it or not, she immediately drew venom from the chemical companies, government bureaucrats. For example, former Secretary of the Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, said, and this is a quote, she's probably a communist. Yeah, I mean, just didn't flinch. There's a wonderful biography out on Rachel Carson called Rachel Carson, Witness for Peace, Witness for Nature. She certainly was becoming aware of peace issues and the peace movement. But unfortunately, she just died right after 1964 of cancer herself. Um, but others picked up. I mean, to give you a sense, this is very important, Kyle. Others picked up on this vicious red baiting. It was very difficult for anyone to say anything about the government or what the government was doing, or in this case, chemicals from a chemical company. Here's a quote from a period letter to the editor of The New Yorker. If you're familiar with that magazine, still exists, actually. This is a quote, a letter to the editor. Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies, like a lot of our writers these days. We can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs? As long as we have the hydrogen bomb, everything will be okay. End of quote. Wow. It's just an amazing, it would take another podcast to just unload and unpack what that person wrote way back in the 50s. Anyway, there's so much anti-communist, anti-women, anti-peace venom built into that. You have to wonder if the writer ever ate insect pollinated fruits like an apple, Yeah. just understanding that much, but I think we're a little better with that now. Anyway, Rachel Carson, unbelievably, I mean, not really, certainly not politically left. She persevered these hateful attacks, stuck with the truth, and she's often cited as a key contributor to the origin of Earth Day and the modern environmental movement. And there's certainly truth in that. But that backstory, which we'll get back to very quick, what happened in the 1950s, Virginia Bronine, the tooth study, baby tooth study, we can talk more about that. Paralleling all this, in the early 1960s, President Kennedy, Democrat, sent the first U.S. troops into Vietnam. Of course, Lyndon Johnson would follow that, and followed by President Nixon, who was elected as a peace candidate, if you can imagine that. He was a Republican and greatly expanded the U.S. war in Vietnam. It kind of reminds me now of the support Trump was giving to backward elements, fascist elements in Ukraine. And unfortunately, the Democratic administration, Biden, now has picked up on that. Anyway, shoot right back to the 1960s, anti-communism was resulting in a real bloodletting, a hot war in Vietnam. In Martin Luther King, in his very famous 1968 Riverside Church speech in New York, he connected the devastation in Vietnam and the killing of people to the oppression of people of color at home. That was a very, very important connection, and it really made us begin to see the connection between the civil rights movement, human rights, war, peace. All those were coming together as they are now. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Because then the revelations of the cruel and genocidal use by U.S. forces in Vietnam of Agent Orange and Dow Chemical, Monsanto were reaping mega profits from this chemical warfare. Uniroyal Chemical, right here in Naugatuck, Connecticut, along the Naugatuck River, was part of that process. So the environment, war, human rights were all coming together as they usually do. And those huge demonstrations I mentioned to you, 1968, 69, 71, they grew in size and effectiveness. Now, to connect back to that 1950s stories with the baby teeth, in 1969, Scientist and Citizen changed its name to Environment. And in the journal Environment quickly became the most prestigious journal in its field. So we have this journal Environment that scientists read from all over the world. It's translated and everything. And how many of those scientists don't even realize how that journal came about with its grassroots, reaching back to the 1950s in St. Louis, and this combination of women, leading movements. Then women lead the environmental movement now. You don't have to dig far into the environmental movement. You come up with, women leaders. So now we'll go back to the late 1960s, early 70s in terms of the origin of the first Earth Day, Rachel Carson, we already mentioned. It was the time that Senator Gaylord Nelson, he was a Democrat out of Wisconsin, former governor there. He took the initiative to put together many of these struggles and movements. He saw the potential in them. He wanted a grassroots approach similar to some of the anti-war, what were called teach-ins on college campuses then. And I had attended some of those teach-ins in the 60s and eventually early 70s, because it really had reached deep into, to young people at this point. And Senator Nelson was a smart guy. He hired Dennis Hayes, who was a former Stanford student president. I think at that point he was in Harvard Law School, but he was very much involved in the grassroots movements in the 60s. Hayes was. And he very smartly hired a team of activists that were steeped in civil rights, the Chicano movement at the time, those that were around Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1968. Of course, he was eventually assassinated in 68, along with Martin Luther King. But those activists were there. And he pulled them together. I think I saw a number at one point. It was 85 full-time activists. And they pulled together a grassroots gathering of 20 million people, as you mentioned in your question, your very first question, second question. 20 million people came together on April 22nd, 1970, the very first Earth Day. Now, like all mass movements like that, they had wonderful consequences and follow-ups, like an election, really. The action didn't stop on April 22nd, 1970. In 1971, the word spread that the military was planning now nuclear weapon explosions tests on Amchitka Island in part of the Aleutian archipelago off Alaska. And a group of brave activists set off on an old fishing boat to get in the way of that test. Can you imagine? Long story short, they were unsuccessful. They were grabbed by the U.S. Navy. But it did lead to the international organization known as Greenpeace. And Greenpeace, with its 2.9 million supporters, now in 40 countries. And Amchitka Island now is a bird sanctuary. Now there's a whole backstory to that too. Dozens of Amchitka workers and the Aleuts, native people, have died. They weren't there with the bombing. Of course, they hadn't been on that island for 100 years, but they certainly lived around there and adjoining islands. They were impacted by leaking radiation they did actually eventually 3 underground nuclear tests there, starting from the 60s to 1971. These were underground tests now, because the tests were becoming more and more limited because of these mass movements. So they were testing under the ground. Believe it or not, when they set off that, the United States now, that this underground test, the land on Amchitka Island blew up 20 feet and settled back down 20 feet. Can you imagine that?
Huh.
And that bomb was detonated a mile under Amchitka Island. There's so many stories that flow from this. Kyle, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the Iraq War, a couple Iraq wars, but in the early millennium, Greenpeace came out against the Iraq War, and they immediately lost a third of their membership.
Oh, wow.
Now, and that shows that, an important point here is that the environmental movement, and here we have, a movement called Greenpeace, to combine the two names, and it's the name of the group could lose a third of its membership. It shows that the Cold War, lingered, and it's gone, essentially, the first one. But now, as you know, we talk with the Biden administration, Cold War 2.0, it lingered. And this was back in 2000. Greenpeace would lose a third of its membership.
Over the Iraq war in Iraq.
Yeah, the second war. And so Greenpeace loses a third of its membership. And it shows the lack of depth of understanding in the environmental movement. We have a lot of work to do there to connect it again, and more deeply with these stories to the peace movement. And that's when it becomes real effective.
Mm-hmm.
And so not to lose Earth Day, landmark legislation follows the first Earth Day, such as the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. So all this landmark legislation gets passed during the Nixon administration. Could you imagine Republicans running around and say, "Oh yeah, we're responsible for the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act"? It's just all bunk. Nixon had nothing to do with it. He was forced from grassroots activities to sign those. And then, of course, there gained momentum right through that period to impeach him, impeach President Nixon for, the high crimes, the Watergate crimes that happened throughout his presidency. And he was driven out of office in 1964. So all these, false narratives are very important to dispel. So even the one that I was hearing from the state legislature just 5 years ago, but they're dangerous, as I said, because if we don't paint accurate pictures of such momentous events as the first Earth Day in 1970s, attempts, to move with other needed social political changes like renewable energy, reparations, for example, for African Americans, they'll lead to dead ends. We need to know the real history. And such changes share, there's some shared distinguishable characteristics. Attempts to rewrite history, and grossly distort it, and unfortunately, are legion, even in our history. It didn't start with the Trump administration. The movie Rebirth of a Nation, 1915, is a good example. When the film came out, President Woodrow Wilson had viewings of it in the White House.
Yeah.
It gave, this racist movie gave unfortunate legitimacy of this rewriting of history going back into the 19th century. Its skewed view of U.S. history included stereotyping of slaves, Black people generally. Wilson was actually responsible for resegregating Washington, D.C. back then. And of course, he ran as a peace candidate in 1914 to keep, the USA out of the First World War, starting in 1914. But in 1917, he led the USA right into World War I. There's a lot written about that. Eric Larson, very popular writer, wrote the movie Dead Wake, goes into some of that early 1914 history. It's worthwhile reading. Now, President Trump, of course, is the chief follower of those who rewrite history to fit their fancy. He had a picture of President Jackson displayed in the White House as symbolic of his white nationalist ways. Jackson, of course, was a slave owner, instigator of genocide against Native peoples, and promulgating his image, along with praising Jackson's presidency, speaks volumes about that ideology and the politics that followed in its train. Trump's policies and approach to politics is to disunite people and disunite our country. Misogyny, male chauvinism, anti-immigrant ideas. He gave currency to all those, and they hang over. So racism and anti-communism are, they're the chief ideological bulwarks behind this disunity. We have to expose racism and anti-communism at their roots and currently to bring people together. So there's a need to bring this true history involving both anti-war forces as well as environmental forces, moving forward versus those who would rewrite it and put up false narratives. Unity of people with different political persuasions and all people, of color, sexual orientation is a must to win back our country from what was really the brink of fascism back in July 6, 2021. There's so much more we could reach back to. That tooth survey is the last thing I want to say. It may seem like nothing, but it was extremely important. They sampled baby teeth in 1963 and compared it to baby teeth in 1950, and they found the baby teeth in 1963 had 50 times more strontium-90, that radioactive isotope, compared to the baby teeth in 1950. That information, along with Rachel Carlson's work on pesticides, but this information reached right into the White House, and it led 1963 to the partial test ban treaty. Unfortunately, it didn't involve underground testing. That's why Amchitka Island was possible in the later 60s and 1971. But these grassroots activities, reaching back into the 1950s, had real ramifications. I mean, it's like we say, elections have consequences. Well, mass grassroots movements have wonderful consequences. And if we're going to reimagine the peace movement, this nexus of the environment and peace, we've got to get these stories out there. Yeah, so there's so many more, but I think I've given you and listeners a lot to chew on here.
Absolutely. So we've established Earth Day. It started in 1970 on April 22nd, and it's still going on. And we want to talk about this important connection between the peace movement and the environmental movement. And we know that the peace movement right now in the United States is not as strong as it could be and should be probably. And we're seeing US imperialism just continue to expand, and more wars and threats of wars and what they call cold wars leading to hot wars. I mean, it's we're not in a great place right now. And I think that it's important for people to understand the connection between imperialism and the environment. And I know in your preparation for this podcast, we had talked about Frederick Douglass and an important lesson that you learned from Frederick Douglass. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Frederick Douglass, among many famous quotes we have from him, he said, "No part of the past is dead or indifferent." End of quote.
Hmm.
And this story from his life is instructive. And it has to do with coal. Coal is a fossil fuel. It's the dirtiest of them all.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually responsible for just one way for all of us to grab a hold of it. We talk about that 1 centigrade increase in global average temperatures. Coal is responsible for 3/10 of that 1 centigrade increase in global average temperatures. Can you imagine? So, yes, there's a story here about fossil fuels, which Greens will relate to, but also peace advocates in what was called back then gunboat diplomacy. We have other names for it now, but yeah, here's the story. And it also involves putting the label of dictator on a person, which we see happen so often now, that has very, very bad political consequences, even though that person may be not somebody you'd sit down and have tea with, but it's used to provoke invasions and a lot of other things. So, what happens when we hear the word dictator, we'll get right to Frederick Douglass, but the media and their billionaire owners want you to picture that little guy with the funny mustache or the guy with the barrel chest who's always got his chin in the air, Mussolini. They want you to transfer those images to a present day dictator, and they repeat the word endlessly. We'll hear it relative to China, we'll hear it relative to Putin in Russia, and I'm not equating those two, but that's the way it's used. Anyway, let's go back to the 19th century history with an eye toward how it might be applicable to our present circumstances, which you're raising. And yes, it had very much to do with coal, and it had very much to do with excuse me, what was called then gunboat diplomacy. Frederick Douglass, born in 1818 and left this world in 1895. He was an escaped slave, which a lot of people know this part. He dedicated his life to abolitionism. In other words, he was an anti-slavery fighter who was also for equality. Not all those who were for freeing the slaves were for equality too, see? So the abolitionist was the hardcore radical center of the anti-slavery movement. And he's a towering figure of 19th century U.S. history. You may have heard of William Lloyd Garrison, had a big influence on Douglass. And that beckoned, when Douglass made his way to freedom, he hooked up with the Garrisons, but the Garrisons were opposed to political parties and voting. Here's a real lesson. And this escaped slave grew to wanted political parties that would support abolitionism and voting. So he broke with the Garrisons over the need to get political party and participate in elections. That's a real lesson for all young people now in particular, but all people. You got to have political power and you got to participate in elections. Moving faster forward, Douglass actually, here's some little unknown history. Douglass actually housed John Brown for a while before his famous raid on Harper's Ferry. And because Douglass thought there was a lack of a detailed strategic plan, he didn't go on the raid. He felt it just wasn't planned out. The raid itself and the follow-up wasn't planned out extensively enough. And Brown was there in Douglass's home, in New York State, with a model of Harper's Ferry explaining, everything to be done. But he didn't buy into that particular action. And supported Brown, of course, but Douglas became famous as a motivational abolitionist speaker, as we know. And if readers can get to any book, there's a wonderful biography out called Frederick Douglass by David Blight, 2018, that's go through this story and many other stories that are very important. Anyway, what few people know is that many, many years later, Douglas becomes a U.S. minister to Haiti in 1889. Douglas was a great admirer of Toussaint Louverture, who led the successful slave rebellion, overturning French rule on Haiti. He knew they were a very proud, independent people, and when he got the opportunity, he took this opportunity to be U.S. minister to Haiti. So as minister and consul general, Douglas arrives in Haiti to find this General Hippolyte, was the name, in power. While he was a dictator in modern lingo, how he came to power is instructive. This Hippolyte ascent to power was thanks to 17 Gatling guns that were supplied to him by an American merchant. And we were, sending arms to the world even then in, late 1880s. And of course, these American merchants had their eyes on commercial interests, also backers of all this, commercial interests in Haiti. So the U.S. government asked Douglas to secure a harbor at this point for exclusive U.S. coal interests. And he took the job on thinking, well, it would be both good for the U.S. and Haiti. But then he was to learn some hard lessons. While he was negotiating with Haitian leaders, 2 U.S. gunboats appeared offshore, unbeknownst to him, independent of him. Then 4 gunboats appeared. Then 7 gunboats appeared. So what Douglas and the Haitians were learning is what was called back then gunboat diplomacy. And while the talks, they felt Douglas wasn't moving the talks fast enough for U.S. commercial interests. So there was a steamship line owner called William Clyde and a U.S. admiral called Giraldi. They wanted payback now from Hippolyte. They felt they had helped put this guy in power. Now you got to do our bidding. And they expressed this with vehemence. I mean, Hippolyte knew his life was in danger with these gunboats sitting, outside his door. But he actually survived that. The Haitians rejected this blatant attempt to have the United States use them as kind of like a coal depot stopping off point. And Douglas, of course, saw the white supremacy in these actions dominating the negotiations. And this guy, Hippolyte, was seen as an obstacle to U.S. commercial military interests. So there was a rebellion, but he survived it. Long story short, Douglas was learning about dictators, imperialism, fossil fuel companies, commerce, all the dangers of militarism. He resigned as minister in 1891. And to show you how he learned the lesson, he accepted President Hippolyte's offer to represent Haiti at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. So Douglas was, he was a quick learner, obviously, right, from his whole background. So yeah, that's a very instructive lesson, that we can continue with because coal, began its threat to the environment back then, and because some of the biggest threats now, right?
There's a lot that we can learn from the past and making those connections to the present day so that past mistakes don't get repeated, because as we know, history does have a tendency to repeat itself if we don't learn. So in today's moment and right now, with the war that's going on and the threats of Cold War becoming a hot war, what do you consider the biggest threats to the environment?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I'll try to be a little less long-winded with these. Yeah, sure. The Willow fossil fuel proposal by ConocoPhillips is projected, and that's for Alaska. I wish we had a map here, but it's for Alaska, proposed by this, ConocoPhillips, big time oil gas company, and it's projected to spew out carbons and profits for the next 30 years. In the environmental movement, we call it a carbon climate change bomb. ConocoPhillips, give it its quick background, made $8.1 billion in 2021. $8.1 billion in 2021. That's just profits. And they're in 14 countries.
Huh.
Now, to jump back and make I hope this wasn't too long ago in my spiel here, but that Plume and Atwood factory in Thomaston, Connecticut, that was throwing those fiery metals into the Naugatuck River that spewed up those vapors that engulfed me, it's gone, right? And industries like the Torrington Company that was making the daisy cutters weapon is gone, but they have different names now. You know, it doesn't mean this manufacturing and production is gone. The military industrial financial complex remains, but it's dominated by monopoly. Monopoly, of course, means concentration of capital, resources, and people. It continues, and with that, fascist dangers rise. That's that concentration of capital makes for these things. So, for example, and we'll get back to the Willow very quickly, but in Connecticut, you may have heard of Pratt & Whitney. Well, it's now Raytheon and Pratt & Whitney in Hartford. And it's Lockheed Martin in Stratford, used to be Sikorsky, making those Black Hawk helicopters. And it's GE building nuclear submarines in New London. $19 billion poured from the Department of Defense poured into Connecticut in 2019. So, you know, very quickly, what we're getting to is the killing of the environment and its twin war partner remain. Now it's the Ukraine, and it's a battle over partly in Europe's methane market. And the profits are part of that imperialist prize. That's a lot what's being battled over. Who's going to get that methane market? So we now have a different kind of river. We have a river of war and climate refugees, right? And that follow in its aftermath. It happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, now Ukraine. Now go back to the Willow area. What's being challenged here, and here's the way really to make this nexus between the environmental movement and the peace movement. There's a vast diversity of other beings there. 3 different species of bears. There's caribou. There's these large migrant animals that people in the environmental movement relate to, and it's in the crosshairs of the Biden administration with this ConocoPhillips proposal for the Willow area, because that's very close to the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, was beats deep in the hearts of environmentalists in this country. So just as the U.S. war in Vietnam and its state monopoly capitalism, it feeds imperialist wars. It's the same connection we were making with Agent Orange, and actually Gulf Oil was drilling off the coast of Vietnam back then. The U.S. Defense Department is the single largest institutional fossil fuel user in the world.
Yep.
And in media, another point in the monopoly concentration of capital, think about it, the electronic world of Elon Musk. You think of Elon Musk, more people with Tesla, he's controlling Twitter. In print, you have Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon. He's got the Washington Post as his plaything. And then you have far too many politicians as cheerleaders of the war. You know, you have these politicians, we have them in Connecticut, Democrats, that become cheerleaders for war.
Yeah.
Because they feed these giant companies that I've ticked off, and that feeds their political campaigns, electoral campaigns. And yet these wars have become earth-scorching machines. So the threats, to sum this up, is certainly the war in Ukraine. They're using now, or it's coming that depleted uranium shells are going to be used there. So, you know, fascism thrives with war, and that's going on in the Ukraine. Fascist elements there. That war in Ukraine actually started in 2014. That's what you got to learn about. There's also this AUKUS agreement you may be familiar with that's aimed at China. Excuse me. AUKUS stands for Australia, the UK, and the United States. And there's this agreement about nuclear submarines that we have to clue the environmental movement in. That's a big danger, you know, as we move each closer to nuclear war. What is it? The atomic scientists have the danger clock is just a minute and a half away from midnight now. And the environmental movement needs to learn about this. Everybody has to learn about it. Lula in Brazil knows about it. They just tried a fascist coup there, which was put down, as it was put down here on January 6th. And he said it well. He said, this is a quote, "To defend democracy is to fight for peace." And I think that's, you know, a lot where we're at when it comes to the present moment. You hear a lot about reimagining the peace movement. So how is that going to happen? Well, if you think of everything we've been talking about here, it's the involvement of people of color. It's really labor, organized labor, hooking up with people of color, young people, women, and also, hooking up with the environmental movement. It's environmental movement is a mass movement here, but it needs depth to it. That we're just talking about. It needs to get involved with organized labor. Young people and the women are there. People of color are not as much. So all this has to happen and be hooked up with the peace movement, like that giant climate march we had in 2014. I was proud to march in, and a lot of other people. But we need that movement to connect to peace, to get things charged and recharged.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed, it does seem like when we're in these times of war, that the environment kind of takes a back seat in terms of what the media covers. Because there was a time not many years ago, pre-Trump, when you would see some stories on in the mainstream media talking about the environment and the dangers of climate change. And Obama worked to get the Paris Climate Accord set up and everything. And so there was a moment where, then young people like Greta Thunberg came out and protested, but then we're all just very forgetful and have short attention spans. And now the mainstream media is mainly focused, obviously, on the war, and you're seeing politicians on both sides, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that are supporting sending more and more weapons overseas to fight proxy wars against Russia and China, of course.
Sure.
But there's this disconnect between the environment and the destruction that war causes. One of the things that really kind of blew my mind learning about Agent Orange was not only the destructiveness to humans, but to the planet. I mean, they were spraying those chemicals to make it impossible to farm the land there. And so I think that you're right that we do have a lot of work to do to connect these movements, this environmental movement and the peace movement. And I'm wondering what ideas you have as a longtime activist here on what some strategies might be to get that back into the forefront of everyone's minds.
Sure. And it's a green and also combined with peace strategy. And it has to come together. Sometimes people, as you say, just don't know how to get started with activism that are so global, like climate change. The threat of nuclear war can seem so overwhelming. The best way I would suggest listeners here and to get involved is at the grassroots. And I'll just tick off some ways. There are sunrise hubs in schools throughout our country. These are young people that are focusing, not just the environment generally, but climate change. And I would tap into those, and you will learn from these young people, and you might also be able to help them make the connection between climate change and fossil fuels and war. That's a place to go. There's also now being circulated the Green Amendment, also called the Environmental Rights Amendment, which actually, just due to history, already exists in New York, Pennsylvania, Montana, but it needs to be introduced elsewhere. It's just recently being talked about in Connecticut, I know. And what that would do, it says that we all have a right to clean air, clean water, with social justice markers built into it, especially for people of color. And I'd have to say, it's advanced. It's going to take a lot of work, but if you poke around in your state long enough, or just Google Green Amendment, you'll come up with this. And I would say certainly an environmental rights amendment would be part of a socialist Bill of Rights as we move much further along. It would have to be there. In Connecticut, we're very lucky to have the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs. So that's one place people to go, particularly trade unionists. They've done incredible work in very grassroots and actually have had success starting the building of a deep water port down in New London so that big barges carrying wind turbines can be brought in there. And we're going to have a wind turbine farm off of Connecticut, Rhode Island. How about that? And that's due to that Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs. It's trade unionists getting together with environmentalists. I'd also suggest locally, you could do this at any town. I don't care what the size of it is. Form a climate and refugee committee. We're losing the environment, and people ask me, well, how, even in Connecticut, how does climate change affect us? We've lost the lobster industry in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Gone. It used to be a booming industry, but the waters have warmed too much. It's a longer story, of course, but and lobsters now are found, further north, but that industry is gone.
Yep.
So there's an example of what climate change can do to your jobs, and it happened to you. And now, it's not, there's climate refugees and there's war refugees. There's already 8 million war refugees from the Ukraine, 8 million outside the country. Now, that's a country of only 44 million people. That's an enormous amount of people. So forming a climate and refugee committee can be climate refugees and war refugees. And you could raise consciousness to a reimagined peace movement right there. Tenant struggles are going on now in many places, and it's beginning to be raised. The tenants have a right to good conditions inside their living abodes, but also outside. I don't know if you've heard of the 330-300 rule, but that means that every tenant, when they look out a window, every homeowner looked out a window, you should see 3 trees. If you walk outside, you should have 30% shade, and you should be within 300 meters, going up to 1,000 feet. You should have a green natural area, hopefully a passive area, but a green area to walk to. It's called the 330-300 rule. And that's beginning to be incorporated into tenant struggles, not only the inside, but the outside. And lastly, and I promised to get back to passive open space, you want to learn about politics locally, go out and save land. Pick out a spot that's really means a lot to you as a person. It might be the vista, it might be the wildlife there, it might be recreation that you have there. Pick it out and save it as passive open space. That is land with porous, permeable land, as we talked about in the beginning, that allow green organisms to grow. That'll enhance the quality of life in your town or city, no matter how urban or how rural. And it'll draw people to it, especially if you win. It's kind of like the Dallas Cowboys in football. When you win, people find you. But anyway, through the process of that struggle, win, lose, or draw, you will attract people, and you will begin to build an environmental movement that very quickly can be connected to the peace movement, because passive open space is a climate change mitigator. So, in conclusion, Kyle, and my voice is just about totally gone. Greens need to get on the peace train. That's what it amounts to. And if we're going to reimagine the peace movement, it's got to include the environment, its issues and struggles. And there's a wonderful slogan out there. We used to say people before profits, or people and nature before profits. A spin-off of that, a wonderful spin-off, is people, planet, and peace before profits. I count 4 P's there. People, planet, and peace before profits. You got to get that out there. Everybody can relate to that slogan, and reimagine this peace movement that involves the environmental struggles.
Wow. There's lots of work to be done, but
yeah,
there's definitely mass movements that are already doing this work, and everyone can find something that is close to them that they can support. And it's inspiring to see and hear from people who are doing this work to understand. I think the main takeaway for me when studying the environment and reading about the destruction, and it feels like it's just impending doom and environmental collapse, and that it's real easy to get disheartened, and it's real easy to become apathetic. And conversations like these are a great way to combat that, because apathy gets us nowhere.
Yeah, agreed. Everything I ticked off, Sunrise Hubs, the struggle around a green amendment, the climate and refugee work, tenant struggles that involve the outside, passive open space, those are all grassroots handles. No need. Yes, there's frustration, but you go out there and do these things, and and people start making connections on their own. But you got to get going, and you got to get a handle on it. And it does take conscious elements to connect peace and the environment.
Len, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. And is there anything you wanted to plug? Any articles you've written recently? Any books? Anything people can check out?
Yeah, there's plenty. I understand you're going to post them, so I'm not going to bore people with that. I'm heading for a cup of coffee.
Okay.
And I'm sure listeners are too, if I haven't totally worn them out. Thanks, Kyle.
All right. Thanks so much, Len. And we'll hopefully talk again soon.
I hope so.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.